showed up in Mecklenburg County. They were Scotch-Irish who had originally landed in Philadelphia, lived in Pennsylvania for a time, figured the taxes were too high, and they moved to Virginia. And they liked the Virginia Shenandoah Valley. It was kind of pretty, but the taxes were too high. So they kept moving until they got to Mecklenburg County, where nobody else lived, and they figured the taxes would be lower. They created a community that for many, many years, for arguably about a century and a half, was a leader in North Carolina in the fight for freedom. In fact, Adam Alexander and a couple of other of my ancestors were part of a group of about 24 Mecklenburg County leaders who in 1775 in May convened to figure out what they were going to do, because at the time the British Crown was violating the rights of the colonists. There had been troubles in Boston. Many of the other colonial leaders figured that something was going to have to change, and the leaders of Mecklenburg decided to get together and figure out how to set up their own county government independent of the colonial governor, who at the time was Tryon, who lived out in the, I guess Newburgh would have been the state capital, or the colonial capital. So the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was just somewhat mythical, but something significant happened in May of 1775, and these patriots declared that they would not be subject to the arbitrary whims of a tyrannical ruler. They did this in 1775. Some of you may know that the American Revolution, while there were some interesting events that occurred up north, the actual war was won in the Carolinas. So Charlotte has a great history of fighting for freedom. Is it just a history? Or can there be a new chapter written of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County fighting for freedom in 2012 and beyond? I think there can be such a chapter, and I hope that you'll work on it. I want to tell you a little bit about the John Locke Foundation and what we do, and a little bit about my book and some of the things we've been working on for North Carolina. As was mentioned, the John Locke Foundation was created as a think tank that would focus on North Carolina. We don't spend a lot of time duplicating all the great conservative and free market organizations in Washington that work on federal issues. We don't do much of that. What we work on primarily are issues that are before our state legislature, our governor, if you're paying attention, the county officials, the city officials, state and local issues that affect us every day. Taxes, regulations, education, which is our primary business in the state level, is education. Our second biggest business is actually Medicaid, free health care benefits. We also have law enforcement and courts and the other traditional roles of the state. So that's what the John Locke Foundation does. So the first thing I have to explain when I'm telling people about the Locke Foundation is that John Locke is not available for an interview. People will call, I'm not kidding, people will call our office and ask to speak to Mr. Locke, or they will write us a letter and say our high school club is going to Philadelphia, can Mr. Locke give us a grant? So they're having trouble understanding that John Locke died in 1704, and we don't give money away, we beg for money. So that's not the kind of foundation we are. We're named after John Locke because he was a great philosopher of liberty, and also because he had a connection to the Carolina colony. And the Carolina colony really began life in the 1660s under the restored Stuart monarch Charles II. Carolina was actually supposedly honoring his father, the guy who had his head chopped off in 1649. So Carolina is actually a term that describes a tyrannical king who was executed by his citizens. I'm not sure that's really a great name. Hey, that's our name. And they had to draw up a colonial constitution. There were 8 proprietors of this colony at the time, and the lead proprietor had a secretary, an aide named John Locke. And John Locke wrote, probably, our fundamental constitutions of Carolina in the 1660s, which was our founding document as an English colony. Now, it was kind of a strange document, and we wouldn't really have wanted to live under it. But one thing that it did do helped to set the stage for a peculiar Carolina tradition of freedom, which is that in the Carolina colony, you did not have to belong to the established church in order to have political rights. It was one of the first colonies that really enshrined the idea of religious liberty. Lots of the reasons why, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, like some of my ancestors, and Baptists, and Quakers, and Jews, and other folks moved to North Carolina because there was a greater amount of religious freedom than there was even in, say, Virginia. In Virginia, during the period leading up to the Revolutionary War, if you were not a member of the Anglican Church, you could not be legally married, your children could not be baptized. If you had somebody that didn't really like you, they'd take you to court and say you weren't legally married, accuse you of bigamy, and steal your property. This is how the English ruled the colonies, and North Carolina was a little different, at least for a while. So John Locke helped to create that tradition of freedom, and we believe that we can learn from history, that the ideas that not only our country was founded on, but our state, our colony of Carolina was founded on, are ideas that are not old musty things in books that we learn about and then we take a test and then we forget. Maybe before the test we forget. That's not what we should be doing. We should be constantly applying these principles to the challenges of today because they are timeless. The idea that human beings are born with certain inalienable rights endowed by their Creator, and among these are life, liberty, and property. And I'm quoting John Locke. I'm not quoting Thomas Jefferson, who admitted he sort of ripped off parts of the Declaration of Independence from John Locke. That's okay. Plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery. But what John Locke was getting at, and what Thomas Jefferson was getting at with the phrase pursuit of happiness, it's not so much that you have the right to own stuff and people can't take your stuff. That is a property right. They were getting at the idea that you have the right to go out and work and to own the fruits of your labor, not have it taken away by a government or anybody else. So it was a concept of economic liberty that Thomas Jefferson meant when he said the pursuit of happiness. In fact, in the North Carolina Constitution, I sort of like the way this is added to. We have a phrase in our beginning of our Constitution that also respects the rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the right to own the fruits of your own labor. That's in the Constitution, the state Constitution. You have a state constitutional right to low taxes. It's being violated, but it is a state constitutional right. Okay. So the John Locke Foundation was created in 1989. Essentially what happened was during the Reagan years, I was at Carolina. And you're absolutely right. I did suddenly discover one day that it was a liberal town. And decided that there were plenty of conservatives and libertarians in Carolina during the Reagan years who wanted a chance to express themselves. They weren't getting it through the traditional institutions. So we created a magazine called the Carolina Critic. And we published it for several years. Eventually, a successor magazine, the Carolina Review, actually took over the Carolina Critic's assets and so forth. And the Carolina Review is still being published at Chapel Hill. For a while, we were also publishing at NC State, UNC Charlotte, UNC Greensboro, and Wake Forest. So what I decided after I spent some time as a newspaper reporter in North Carolina and as a magazine reporter in Washington, I worked for the New Republic in Washington right at the beginning of the first Bush administration in 1988-89. It's an interesting place to work. This was a liberal magazine that had some conservatives in it. So this was a place where I worked for Fred Barnes and Morton Contracting, and the rest of the staff answered to Michael Kinsley. So it was a very interesting place to start my career in Washington. I learned a lot about how to argue my case, because you pretty much had to argue your case to get an article in the magazine. You had to argue it against people who were predisposed to disagree with you. So you had to argue that, well, I know you disagree with this, but it's an interesting article for the following reasons. It was good training. But I decided I wanted to come back to North Carolina. And what I essentially did is I took some of my staff from my student magazine and said, you guys don't really want to ever grow up, do you? And they said, no. So we'll just come work for me. We'll keep doing the same thing, except we'll do it at the state level. So we started the John Locke Foundation with some support from some North Carolina business leaders around the state. One of them was a fellow named Ed Morris, who lived in Greensboro. Mr. Morris at the time was approximately 90 years old. He was a brilliant businessman. He was the head of a company called Bluebell. You would know them better as Wrangler Jeans. And Mr. Morris had really pioneered the use of advertising to recreate the perception of a product. You know, when people wore overalls and blue jeans in the early 20th century, they were just hicks. Okay, if you wore blue jeans or overalls, people would make fun of you. No one could ever imagine wearing blue jeans unless you were out in the field. And what he did is he completely changed the perception of blue jeans. He hired Hollywood actors and cowboy stars to wear jeans and wear his jeans and endorse his jeans. He changed the perception of the blue jean industry, and of course lots of other companies prospered because of that. And so he was a brilliant marketer. And even at the age of 90, he was a brilliant man. And he recognized he was a conservative. He had been a long-time board member and donor to the Right to Work Committee in Washington. He was convinced that North Carolina needed to have a conservative infrastructure to argue for free markets and limited government at the state level. And he believed, and he was right, that it wasn't so much we needed to manufacture new products. We already had a great product, Liberty, just like he had a great product, blue jeans. We had to figure out a way to market it more effectively in North Carolina through the traditional media and through creating our own conservative media. So he was one of our seed donors. Another man named John Pope was one of our seed donors. He is now no longer, neither of these fellows is with us anymore, but John Pope was a leader in retail. Actually, in the Southeast, his company still owns, 400 or 500 stores in the Southeast. They acquired the Roses chain and the Maxway chain and a variety of other retail chains. And in John Pope's world, anything is good, but if you can do it 5% cheaper, it's even better. This is how he made his millions. You know, if you're in the 5 and dime business, you really you check the nickels and the dimes. The first time I ever met John Pope and his son, Art Pope, who was the current leader of that company, I went out to their headquarters in North Raleigh. Their headquarters was a prefab modulated building, sort of like something you would see at a construction site, you know, where the foreman would be there in this building, and after they finish, they're going to rip it up, either carry it somewhere else or throw it away. That's how ratty it was. So I'll go into this place. The one sign that something interesting was going on is there was a Rolls Royce parked at the back. So I go in there and I meet the Pope family, and they decide they want to go to lunch, so we get in there for Rolls Royce. The first time I'd ever been in a Rolls Royce. That was very nice. And I proceeded to understand why they had a Rolls Royce. Because our Pope and his dad began to debate which of the two Chinese buffet places was the cheapest. One of them, I think, was $4.99, and the other one was $4.59. And they couldn't figure out which one was which, and they wanted to go to the $4.59. Now think about that. The next time somebody says, well, rich people are just lucky, and they don't deserve what they earn, and it's the government's job to redistribute income from the undeserving rich to the deserving poor. The Pope family didn't start out with anything. John Pope didn't have much of anything. He was a rural kid in Harnett County. He started out with, I think, 1 or 2 stores. Ended up creating a huge opportunity for people. There are thousands of people who work at these stores, people who shop at these stores and get good value. And the reason why they succeeded is because they had to debate for about 10 minutes which place would save them 40 cents. Now, they believe, and our other founders believe, that the same mentality should be applied to government. Not that there should be no government. These are not anarchists. These are folks who believe in limited government that does important things, that does it effectively and at a reasonable cost. So that's how we started out at the John Locke Foundation. We have a very clear focus. We're focused on state and local policy in North Carolina. And we're focused pretty much on economic and service issues. We don't work on some issues. There are plenty of organizations that do religious or cultural or social issues. Many of my staff members are very active in those groups, in pro-life groups, gun rights groups, and some of them, I had a very interesting split decision in my staff on the Amendment 1 on the same-sex marriage. I had a number of people for and a number of people against. It's just not an issue that we focus on. Our comparative advantage is to work on taxes, regulations, education, healthcare, transportation. Those are our bread and butter issues. At the John Locke Foundation, we work on them in three ways. We have three lines of business. We do policy research, we do communications and journalism, and we do events and outreach. And most think tanks have these kinds of programs. Our policy research division is exactly what you think it is. A bunch of really nerdy guys and gals who sit in a room and think about things and write about things and write extensively about things and develop expertise and testify before the legislature or county commissions or city councils and answer questions from reporters, some of which are worth answering and some of which you just have to put your teeth, and otherwise communicate their research projects. We have lawyers, economists. I mean, we have to have a lawyer. I mean, I've resisted it for years, but apparently lawyers have some value. I have two brothers who are lawyers. I figure, that's enough, but apparently we had to have a lawyer on staff. We also have a transportation engineer as our transportation expert. So we really go after expertise and deploy that in the interest of freedom in North Carolina. Just to show you how nerdy we are at the Locke Foundation, I was riding here. I was actually doing a little family history research on the way. So first I went to Winston-Salem, then I went to Salisbury, then I went to Concord, finally got here. And along the way, I'm listening to a 36 lecture series on the great minds of the Eastern tradition. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, clapping.
You can tell later. Of course, Warren is laughing.
Just as much of a nerd as I am. So, the reason I bring that up is I was listening to the lecture about a certain Indian philosophy called Jainism. And it turns out, the old story about how 5 blind guys were touching the elephant, they didn't know what they had? That's actually originally a story from the Jain religion of India. And the story goes that 5 blind men were touching different parts of the elephant. One of them touched the tail, said, this is a rope. One of them touches the leg and says, this is a column. One of them touches the flank, so this is a wall. One of them touches the ear of the elephant, said, this is a fan. One of them touches the trunk of the elephant, says, this is a snake. Of course, none of them have it right, and that's the point, is that we often draw conclusions based on incomplete information. What I was thinking about is, this is a perfect metaphor for the liberal media going to Tampa, trying to understand the Republican Party. So imagine 5 or 50,000 blind liberal journalists, and they're touching different parts of the pachyderm. So they touch the tail, and they say, this is a noose. This is a noose. And they touch the leg, and they say, this is a whipping post, because these are evil people. They touch the flank of the elephant, and say, this is a wall. This is a gated community. And they touch the elephant's ear, saying, this is a burqa, because they want to keep women, suppressed. And then they touch the trunk, and they say, this is a snake. I mean, the same thing applies. The media does not understand conservatism. They don't try to understand conservatism. To them, conservatism is very much like the expedition, you read about in National Geographic, where they go to some bizarre, faraway place, and they're trying to understand the people, they don't speak the language, and they don't get it. So it's our job at the Locke Foundation to explain these ideas effectively, because the mainstream media, it's just not going to happen. So the second part of our line of business is we do our own media. The goal is not simply to communicate through mainstream print broadcast outlets, though we do that all the time. But we also publish our own newspaper, Carolina Journal, copies of which are on the table here. Carolina Journal has actually been in existence since 1991. We've broken a number of stories. You may have read stories that led to the conviction of Mike Easley, our former governor. He's now a felon. Former congressman. No, wait a minute. It's a sad day when a governor of North Carolina becomes... Okay, cheer. Yeah. We had a number of other public officials who got in trouble, and I will tell you, just as bluntly as I can, that corruption does not know any political party. And now that the Republicans are in charge of the legislature, and probably will be in charge of the governor's mansion, we're going to keep our eye on you anyways, because that's our job. Our job is to make sure that people, regardless of party, are doing what they're supposed to be doing and following the rules. And in addition to our investigative journalism, we do lots of other explanatory journalism in the paper. We're trying to explain how issues like property rights and tax reform and school choice and health care reform, how they directly affect North Carolinians, and we do that all the time. Now, our events and outreach program, we do an event somewhere in North Carolina at least once a week, often more than once a week. We do big events, we do small events, we do training programs. We have a leadership program that several people here have been through. I'm not sure Ward Percy would admit it.
Oh, sure.
No, okay.
I'm surprised you would claim me.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
I have now outed you as a Morris fellow.
Why would you even claim me as a Morris fellow?
I don't know. Never mind, I didn't say that. But we do a lot of different things to try to create a network of conservative reformers around North Carolina. It's not enough to win elections, okay? It just isn't. You can see with recent Republican miscues in Washington, okay? It wasn't that long ago that we had Republicans in charge in Washington, and they spent too much money, and they enacted regulations that were unwise, and they expanded Medicare. They made bad decisions. Some of them even got corrupt and went to prison. So it's not enough to just win elections. Of course, if you don't win elections, you'll never be in a position to do anything. But you also have to have good ideas. You have to keep yourself on your toes, and maybe groups like ours can keep you on your toes. And you have to have a network of people who can help you succeed, particularly at the state level. Jeff Tart and I were talking about this before the event tonight, that among the big issues that will be on the table in 2013 in Mecklenburg tax reform, there's no more important issue facing North Carolina than our uncompetitive tax code. That's a lot of what my book is actually about, is how are we going to get North Carolina's economy moving again? A lot of that has to do with making our economy more competitive through tax reform and regulatory reform. But I'm here to tell you that if tax reform was easy to do politically, it actually already would have happened. It's going to be tough. It's going to require people to come to Raleigh, not just the people who have been elected, but other people, to pressure those in Raleigh and support those in Raleigh who are going to support good, free market, flat income or sales tax reform. That's what we need. Similarly on education, school choice, higher academic standards, merit pay, performance pay for teachers, differentiated pay, phasing out tenure. These are all things that make perfect sense, that are successful in other states or other countries, and there's a reason why they haven't been done. Because they have strong, established interest groups that prevent them from being done. You have to overcome those barriers, and that's going to take a network of people all around the state. Not just winning one election, but creating an infrastructure over time that supports conservative reform ideas and make sure that they succeed and adjust them if they don't work as expected. And it's an ongoing process. That's what we're trying to do at the Locke Foundation. Not just put some ideas on the table, not just explain those ideas to people, but to create an infrastructure that makes those ideas succeed and stick. Because conservatives who win election today have no guarantee of perpetually being in power. It's the way it is. And that's okay. I mean, obviously, we want a competitive political system. But what that means is you have to have institutions outside of politics that continue the movement and make sure people stay on the straight and narrow. Now, very quickly, before I stop and see if you have any questions, I want you to think about the following scenario. You have a president who's elected on a hope and change platform. We've got to do something new. And the president follows through on that by doing lots and lots and lots of new things, most of them horrible. The economy, after a somewhat modest recovery, immediately stalls out and doesn't grow very much at all. So unemployment remains high all throughout the president's term. The president then gets frustrated because the Supreme Court won't do everything he says, so he starts threatening the Supreme Court. He intimidates them. He wags his finger at them. And by the way, he blames for the country's economic woes not his own policies, but rich people. He calls them economic royalists. These are people, the reason we have a problem in America is because these people won't do their patriotic duty and pay higher taxes. Instead, they want to keep their own money. They will invest their own money as they see fit. We can't allow that. And this president, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt, 1936. He's running for re-election. And he wins. Very skillful re-election. But 2 years later, he suffers a horrible political catastrophe. One of the largest gains for Republicans in the history of the Republican Party in 1938. We face a similar situation. That's why I was explaining it to you. Obviously, we had a similar mentality in Washington, a similar lack of results, a similar imperious nature, a similar willingness to try to browbeat and intimidate the Supreme Court, which, by the way, we succeeded. That's why Roberts changed his vote, in my opinion, because I think he's a wimp. He chickened out. Okay, there's no elaborate philosophy that he was espousing. He chickened out. He knew what was right. He didn't do it. This is how Roosevelt got his policies through, by intimidating the court. This is Obama's plan: intimidate the court. So the only solution you've got is to have somebody else in charge who picks the next Supreme Court justices. That's really the only choice you've got. So, in 1936, there was a U.S. Senator from North Carolina. He was a Democrat. All the senators were Democrats at this point, from the South. His name was Josiah Bailey. He was from Raleigh. He was a lawyer. And Josiah Bailey had started out as a Roosevelt supporter, but quickly grew disenchanted. He was convinced that Roosevelt was making government too big, too intrusive, too much a violation of America's traditional liberty principles. So he started a bipartisan movement to resist the president. They started secret meetings. This was a process that he began with a Republican senator named Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan. They began to meet. They began to come up with an agenda for reform. And unfortunately, the New York Times found out about it and wrote about it, and it fell apart. See how history never really changes? Somebody leaked it to the New York Times. That killed the idea. But Josiah Bailey stood up for it anyway, and he published it as the Conservative Manifesto. And Conservative Manifesto had ideas like reform the tax code, balance the budget, stop excessive regulation, return power to state and local governments. Lots of ideas that are very familiar to us. And while the program didn't pass in 1937, it helped set the stage for a huge Republican victory in 1938. And after that, by the way, the Roosevelt administration did moderate. They had to. They realized their policies weren't working. And on the economics, they actually started to moderate, partly because Roosevelt started to pay more attention to foreign policy. My point is, it takes courage to stand up against the prevailing sentiment of the time and say, no. It took courage for the initial leaders of the Tea Party movement in 2009 to step forward and say, we're not going to accept this. We're going to fight against it. There's a tradition in our country of fighting against tyranny. Again, I would argue that one of the places it started was Charlotte, North Carolina.
Thank you.
And the Tea Party movement was strong in North Carolina too. So it takes courage to do this, but we know from our history, we know from our revolutionary history, we know from our recent political history, that courage married to the proper convictions can lead to victory. And in my view, that's what we need. Not just victory in the electoral sense. Okay, I am not allowed in my position to be partisan, so I'm not going to argue, do this and do that to elect certain candidates. That's important, but I mean victory in a broader cultural sense, that we need a rebirth of our American founding principles of freedom and true self-government. And we need to apply those principles in Washington, in Raleigh, in Charlotte. At some point that becomes possible, I hope. Mecklenburg County, and everywhere else in our country. So why don't I stop there and see if you have any questions about our current political season, or anything I talked about, or anything I didn't talk about. Yes, sir.
With the federal deficit, or the debt rather, $16 trillion, or close to it. The interest on that alone, I mean, we're going to be at close to $20 trillion in the next 4 years, even if we only pay the interest on it. I mean, it's just going to keep going up. What can be done to kind of counteract that, I guess? Several economists I've read have said the raising of taxes is actually inevitable, even if you're a conservative. I guess what's the Locke Foundation's view on that, those policies?
Well, there are some, I would at least say, former conservative economists. Bruce Bartlett, who's an old acquaintance of mine, is one of those who argues that there is no alternative but to raise taxes. Let's just debate which tax is the least costly. My view is that's nonsense, but there's plenty of history in other countries to suggest that raising taxes, to any significant degree at least, does not really help you balance budgets. That your better mix is almost entirely spending reduction. The way I would make a deal is as follows. I would say, sure, I think our revenues need to go up. I don't want to raise taxes. I will sell federal lands and federal assets. I will charge for certain services the government ought not to be delivering anyway. I'll just charge people for it. And I'll reform the tax code so that the economy grows so that more revenue comes in. And that'll increase the revenue as a share of GDP, federal revenue, back to its historical level, which is somewhere between 18 and 19%. And that's it. We don't need to raise taxes. It's a bad idea. Our taxes are high enough. But if you want to raise revenue, I mean, let's stop giving away stuff to corporations, get rid of corporate welfare. Some of that would actually be a revenue gain rather than spending cut. I don't care. This would not tax increase. I would sell off government assets that we don't need. Technically, that's a revenue increase. So if they want to make a deal with revenue, I think conservatives say, yeah, let's make a deal about revenue. Now, we're not going to raise taxes. The liberals don't. They don't want revenue. They want taxes. They want a higher tax burden. Our position should be no. The only revenue we're going to agree to is more tax revenue for economic growth, not through higher rates. And sure, we'll sell off some surplus government assets. Technically, that's revenue. The real action is on the spending side. And we should not underestimate the job here. The problem is to say, well, you know, historically spending has been about 20% of GDP, federal spending. That's not so hard. Well, yes, but we have an older population than we did in the 1980s. And that means that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are a higher share of our budget than they were in the 1980s. Now, I happen to believe we have to reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But there's, again, it's sort of like at the state level with all these great ideas that haven't been enacted. That's because they're tough. And similarly, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid reform are not easy. Now, fortunately, Mitt Romney, his first decision as a prospective president was to hire the Republicans' best legislative expert, Paul Ryan, to pursue the most important of those issues, which is Medicare. That's the one that's hitting us right now. Social Security is starting to hit us, but it's not a big drag yet on the budget. Medicaid is a big drag on the budget, but of a similar, not at its high magnitude. Medicare is our biggest problem, and Paul Ryan's, I think, has got the best solution. I think we can do it. I think we should do it. I think the goal should be to take federal spending down to 19% of GDP over several years. We shouldn't say that's easy because it's not, but we should say it's doable because it obviously is, and it has happened in other places. We can do it. I mean, look, Canada balanced their budget without raising taxes. I mean, the Canadians did. This is like saying people in New Jersey could do something North Carolinians can't. Come on. We can do it. Not to pick on my Canadian friends. Yes, sir.
Now, you've been in church against the bureaucracy which has been all powerful in the state, primarily Democrats. I know you've been pushback, you've been punished and threats. Can you relate any out of how you respond to it?
You mean, have there been threats to us?
Threats, pressure, pushback.
Oh, yeah. You know, it's it always tickles me when if you're in public life in any form, you will get hate mail. You will get hate email in particular. Email is sort of perceived to be kind of a free shot because nobody can figure out exactly who you are, so it's even more profane and absurd than actual mail. You will get hate phone calls and you will get threats. And we've gotten them over the years. And liberals do too, okay? Because anybody in public life, the problem is a lot of these liberals, they go crying to the media, we got threatened. And we don't go crying to the media every time somebody threatens us, we just invest in better security. And a couple of my investigative reporters are, let me just put it this way, they are registered in certain ways with the state of North Carolina that allow them to possess certain kinds of instruments of self-defense. So, my view is that, yes, we've been audited by the IRS, we think for obvious reasons, back in the 90s. Yes, we've been attacked. Yes, we've been vilified in the media. Yes, we've been subject to all sorts of things. And that's all good news to me. That means we're having an effect. What I would really be worried about is the Locke Foundation has been around for 20 years and some change. And no one had ever criticized or threatened us. In fact, I would be deserving of being fired if we had gotten that far along and no one got mad at us. So, sure. We have sued the government on a number of occasions and we always win. No one's ever taken us to court. There have been threats, but they've never... Look, you cannot... When people come and say, you published an article about us, it's incorrect, it's libelous, blah, 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 we always say, well, look, we've got a lawyer, and truth is always a successful defense against libel and slander, so go for it. And they never fight.
That's pretty good.
They never fight. That doesn't mean we always get everything right. We sometimes make mistakes, just like any other news organization does. Carolina Journal, I'm talking about now. Yeah, we've had some mistakes in our paper. We correct them as soon as we find out.
Hearing more about tax policy being a big issue on the table for next year, again, assuming that we win a Republican Party, can you discuss what you would like to see?
Well, there are some general principles that just about everybody in the conservative movement and the Republicans in the legislature agree on. One of them is ditch the corporate income tax. It makes absolutely no sense. It's not worth the trouble. The amount of revenue you get out of it is not worth the bookkeeping and distortive effects of it. It's just literally not worth messing with. It also is not transparent because it's just a way to tax shareholders, workers, and consumers of corporations, and they don't know what their tax burden is because they don't get a bill. So, ditch the corporate income tax, ditch the death tax. These are easy. Well, they're not easy, but we all agree on. Now, where there's some disagreements about what to do after that, one proposal is to phase out the income tax, the personal income tax, and go with a broad-based sales tax to pay for state services. Another idea is to phase out the sales tax and do a broad-based income tax, but only on the income that is consumed. In other words, you take income, subtract savings, the rest of it is consumption. So essentially, these two taxes have the same tax base, but they're gotten to in different ways. And there are pros and cons to each of those models. Many members of the Senate have already said they like the sales tax model. Some members of the House have said they like the income tax model. I'm actually sanguine about this. I think that something productive will come out of this discussion because either of these is better than what we have. And what may actually end up happening is sort of a split the difference. We end up reforming each tax. I mean, I'm not sure what the end result will be, but what I know is if you broaden the base, lower the rates, get rid of the special exemptions, the incentives, the other garbage, because getting rid of incentives by itself is very difficult because it's what an economist would call a prisoner's dilemma problem. I know incentives are bad, but if they do it and we don't, business goes there, so I can't. So I understand that. The way to fix that problem is to have the corporate tax be zero. It is impossible to do better than offering a 0% tax rate. unless you're just going to hand money out, which you shouldn't do. So, state tax reform is going to be a big issue in 2013. I'm not sure where Pat Corey is on it. He agrees with the general philosophy, but the specifics he hasn't stated himself out on. I actually think that's actually wise. But that's what we're talking about is tax reform. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. Let me just ask you quickly your support of a sales tax that would not be a value-added tax. This is a great distinction. Am I correct?
You're correct.
Thank you. Okay. Now, my question.
By the way, I favor getting rid of the sales tax and the bingo tax.
Okay.
But no, the sales tax proposal is a retail sales tax. So all the tax is paid at the point of sale rather than paid at each step of the process.
Exactly. My question is, I'm very interested in your comparison between the 1936 first re-election campaign of FDR and 2012 with Barack Obama. Now, as you're outlining the environment, the political environment, the economic environment, and the comparisons there. Now, what concerns me is that Governor Landon was routed in 1936. So, give me some more information and give me some more of your insight into 2012 that would make me feel a little bit more secure about Governor Romney's chances as opposed to Governor Landon.
Well, there are several important differences between 36 and 2012. One of them is that the Republican candidate in 1936 was outmanned, outgunned, ridiculously outspent, and pretty much the whole establishment was against him. In 2012, the establishment was against you, but the establishment doesn't matter as much as it used to. Romney and Ryan have their own resources to draw back on. They have independent expenditures supporting them. So the resources situation is completely different. Also, there was no clear contrast drawn in 1936. The Republican nominee, nice fellow, okay, but he didn't run as a clear alternative. We're not going to go in this direction. We're not even going to go a little bit different. We're not going to be sort of New Deal, but we'll do it cheaper. There was nothing there. In 2012, Romney and Ryan are drawing a very clear choice, very different positions. So that doesn't mean Romney's going to win. I actually think right now the race is too close to call. It's very, very close. I think the latest average poll is about a point edge for Obama. If you were to just zero in on the likely voter numbers, it'd be maybe slightly less than a point for Obama. Very, very close race. This is not going to be 1936. And even if Romney loses, Republicans are still going to do pretty well in other parts of the ballot. So it's not going to be anything like 36. But the comparison is simply the policies of Obama are similarly bad for America and ineffective. Need to stop?
One more question.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Anything?
Well, Lee's not a ma'am, but
I would do that in Medicare.
you're welcome.
Now, I hope everybody understands Medicare is not a free program like Medicaid. Medicare is mandatory to come over when you turn 65. You also have to have the drug card. That's mandatory as well. So you pay for Medicare out of the government check. You take like $100 a month out of there. Not out that old. But
you're just saying this in theory. If you were to get to the point where you'd be eligible, this is how you do it.
Think about it, you have to have a supplementary like Blue Cross to cover what Medicare doesn't pay. So I'm going to pay like $40 a month. So it's not free. And I don't know why Medicare is in such a strong position.
Because the budget doesn't add up. Because the amount of money that people put into it is not even close to the amount of money it's going to cost to put it in.
It's always like
everybody's forced to pay into Medicare. You can actually technically say no to Medicare, at which point you lose your Social Security benefit. That's the reason why. But look, the debate about whether to have Social Security and Medicare is not the debate we're having. Because for two reasons. Number one, the people who are about to retire or have already retired have built their entire life of finances around a forced program. Now, you can't just And that's what Romney and Ryan are arguing. Yes, we have to change the program because it simply cannot be afforded in its current design. But we can't change it for people who are 68 or 59, or my parents are both on Medicare and they're in their 80s. Okay, you can't change the program now. You have to phase in a change that happens for the next generation that creates more incentives for people to choose less costly care. And what the Ryan plan would do is actually very clever. It would use a bidding process to have companies bid against the program, and the second lowest bid is the one that will be taken. It's a very clever design. It's really it's called premium support. It's technically not a voucher system. It's a system where you could still be in the Medicare program, where you could choose alternatives. You choose alternatives that are more expensive, you pay extra. It's the only solution that I've ever seen that makes any sense. Even if even if he gets his way and he raises taxes on rich people, there's just not enough money to pay for all this, to pay for Medicare. It just doesn't work in that way. So Ryan's plan is the only plan I've seen from a politician that is costed out and makes sense. And even that's going to be tough to do. One of the reasons Medicare is tough to cut is because a lot of the Medicare expenses happen in the last 6 months to 12 months of someone's life. They are heroic efforts to save our mothers, our grandfathers, our spouses, ourselves. Okay, it's hard to say no.
But what about Medicare fraud?
Medicare fraud is a big deal. If we got rid of all Medicare fraud, we reduced Medicaid expenses, I think, by maybe 10%. That wouldn't be enough in the long run. It would be a good start. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you very much.